Stop buying modern cement. The 1880s Amish lime mortar that lasts 200 years, Big Cement banned it. The mortar joints on a Lancaster County barn poured in 1884 are still tight. No cracks, no spalling. The same property has a concrete pad poured in 1998, and that pad is already crumbling at the edges. The difference is the mixture. The Amish never stopped using slaked lime mortar, the exact material the rest of America quietly abandoned between 1920 and 1955. It is still legal. It still works. A backyard batch costs under $30. So why was it written out of every modern building code in that 30-year window? Stay with me. That barn is not a fluke. It is one of thousands. Drive any back road in Lancaster, Lebanon, or Berks County, and you can pick them out by the joints. The stones are local fieldstone, rough and uneven. The mortar between them sits a little softer than the rock, almost chalky to the touch, with hairline texture that catches the morning light. Nothing about it looks engineered. It looks like something a farmer mixed in a wooden trough. And it is. That is exactly what it is. 3 parts sand, 1 part lime putty, water, time. The same recipe a Roman bricklayer would recognize. The same recipe a medieval cathedral mason would recognize. The same recipe an Amish grandfather in 1884 wrote down in pencil and handed to his son. Now compare that to the concrete pad. 26 years old. Cracking. Spalling. The rebar inside has started to rust, and the rust is pushing the concrete apart from the inside out. That pad was poured with Portland cement, which is what every bag at every hardware store in North America contains. And here's the part nobody tells you. Portland cement was never designed to last 200 years. It was designed to set fast and ship in bags. There's a difference between a material that survives and a material that performs on a contractor's schedule. And most homeowners have spent their entire adult lives confusing the two. Think about what that means for your own foundation. Your house, if it was built after about 1950, is almost certainly sitting on Portland-based concrete. The clock on that foundation, under normal conditions, is somewhere between 50 and 100 years. The clock on a properly mixed lime mortar foundation under the same conditions is 200 years, sometimes longer. The Romans poured harbor concrete with lime over 2,000 years ago, and divers are still pulling intact chunks of it out of the Mediterranean. The cathedrals of England were laid with lime mortar in the 1100s. They are still load-bearing. The stone houses of colonial Pennsylvania, Virginia, and Connecticut, the ones with the original mortar still in place, are pushing 300 years and counting. You can walk into a stone farmhouse in Chester County, built before the American Revolution, run your finger along an interior joint, and feel mortar that is older than the country itself. The gap between what your grandfather built with and what you can buy today is not an accident. It is the size of an industry. Here's where the story gets personal. A few years back, a small estate sale in Lancaster County turned up a leather-bound notebook tucked inside a wooden tool chest. The chest belonged to a mason who had died in the 1940s. Inside the notebook, in faded pencil, was a handwritten lime mortar recipe. 3 parts clean sand, 1 part lime putty. Slake the lime for 1 full year before use. There were notes on the side about which quarry produced the best limestone, which sand drew the cleanest water, and which season was best for repointing. There was a note about which colors the mortar would take depending on the local sand. There was a note about how to test a batch by rolling a small ball between 2 fingers and feeling for grit. It was not a chemistry document. It was a kitchen table document. The kind of knowledge that gets passed from a father to a son over a workbench, not in a classroom. That notebook is the whole story in miniature. Because this kind of knowledge did not survive in textbooks, it survived in margins, in handwritten ledgers, in the heads of old masons who never thought to publish it because they assumed everyone already knew it. And then one day, almost everyone did not. The chain broke, not in one moment, but slowly, over 2 generations, while the country was busy paying attention to other things. Now the mechanism. This is the part that should make you stop and think. Lime mortar is alive. That sounds dramatic, but it is literally true in a chemical sense. The recipe starts with limestone. You burn the limestone in a kiln, which drives off carbon dioxide and leaves you with quicklime. You add water, which is called slaking, and you get lime putty. You mix the putty with sand, and you trowel it between stones. So far, nothing surprising. But here's what happens next. Over the following years, decades, even centuries, that mortar slowly pulls carbon dioxide back out of the air. The lime in the wall is trying to return to limestone. And it does. Slowly. Steadily. Every year, the mortar in your wall is a little more like the rock around it. The wall is healing itself. It is breathing. It is curing for 100 years. Read that again. The wall gets stronger over time, not weaker, stronger. There's no other common building material on earth that does this. Wood rots, steel rusts, asphalt cracks, drywall crumbles, Portland concrete fails. Every single thing in a modern house has a curve that bends downward from the day it is installed. Lime mortar is the exception. Lime mortar bends upward for the first century of its life, and then flattens out, and then keeps standing for centuries after that, because by then it has chemically become the rock it was made from. Portland cement does the opposite. Portland sets in a matter of hours through a rigid crystalline reaction. Once it is set, it is done. It does not breathe. It does not flex. It does not heal. What it does is trap moisture. Water gets in through micro cracks, freezes in winter, expands, and tears the concrete apart from the inside. Rebar rusts. Joints fail. Spalling begins. Every freeze-thaw cycle is a tiny demolition. And the manufacture of Portland cement is one of the most carbon-intensive industrial processes on the planet. Roughly 8% of all global carbon dioxide emissions come from making the stuff. 8%. From one material, more than aviation, more than shipping. From the bags you stack in your garage. Not stronger, just harder. Not better, just faster. The Amish noticed this. Or rather, they never stopped noticing it, because they never made the switch in the first place. While the rest of America was tearing down lime kilns and putting in cement plants, Amish masons in Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Indiana kept right on mixing the old way. They built barns. They built spring houses. They built foundations and chimneys and root cellar walls. They built them with 3 parts sand and 1 part lime putty, the same way their grandfathers built. And those structures are still standing. You can drive past them today. You can run your hand along the joints. The proof is not in a laboratory. The proof is in the wall. This was not nostalgia. This was not sentiment. The Amish are practical builders, and they kept lime for the same reason their ancestors did. Because it works. Because it is repairable. Because it does not require an industrial supply chain. And because the wall their grandfather laid is still their wall. A young Amish mason today learns the same ratios, the same trowel technique, the same joint finish that his great-great-grandfather learned. Nothing was lost because nothing was thrown away. So what happened to everyone else? Why did this knowledge fall out of the rest of American building? Stay with me, because this is where it changes. Between roughly 1890 and 1920, lime mortar quietly disappeared from American building manuals. That is not a guess. That is a fact you can verify by pulling old books off a library shelf. A builder's handbook from 1885 will spend an entire chapter on lime, on slaking, on the difference between hot lime and cold lime, on how to judge a good putty, on how long to let it mature, on which limestones from which regions produced which colors and strengths. A builder's handbook from 1925 will mention lime in passing, maybe a paragraph, usually with the word obsolete, somewhere in the description. A builder's handbook from 1955 will barely mention it at all. By the 1970s, most apprentice masons in America had never mixed a batch of lime putty in their lives, and could not have told you how if you asked. The the knowledge did not fade. It was removed from the page. Here is the part nobody tells you. The disappearance was not random. It tracks almost perfectly with the rise of one specific trade group. In 1916, 16 American cement manufacturers got together and founded an organization. They called it the Portland Cement Association. Their stated mission was to promote the use of Portland cement in American construction. Their actual mission, judging by what happened over the next 4 decades, was to make sure no other binding material had a place in a modern building code. They funded research. They published technical bulletins. They sent representatives to standards committees. They worked with state regulators. They placed advertisements in trade journals. They sponsored coursework at engineering schools. They handed out free reference materials to young architects. And slowly, methodically, the language of American building shifted. Lime became old-fashioned. Portland became modern. Lime became weak. Portland became strong. Lime became something your grandfather used. Portland became something a real builder used. Watch that date, 1916. Hold on to it, because the story is not really about a material. It is about a 30-year campaign to replace one material with another. And the campaign worked. So how does a trade group, however well-funded, rewrite the masonry standards of an entire country? That is the question. And the answer is the kind of thing you have to follow into the 1920s, into the 1930s, into the building codes that quietly went into effect while almost nobody was paying attention, into the mortgage regulations that came after the Second World War, and into a federal building material study from the mid-1950s that compared the two materials directly and then quietly fell out of public conversation. That report exists. It still exists. And what it says is the part of this story that the cement industry would prefer you never read. Start with Aspden, Joseph Aspden, an English bricklayer from Leeds. In 1824, he filed a patent for what he called Portland cement, named after the limestone of Portland in Dorset, because he wanted the color and the sound of permanence. The patent was not for a better mortar. The patent was for a faster mortar. Aspden had figured out how to grind limestone and clay together, burn them at very high temperatures, and grind the result into a powder that set in hours instead of months. That was the whole innovation. Speed. He was not trying to outlast the Romans. He was trying to make a binder that a contractor could use the same day it came out of the bag. For about 50 years, almost nothing happened. Portland cement existed in Europe, but it was expensive, the kilns were primitive, and most masons preferred what they already knew. Then American manufacturers got hold of the process. By 1870, there were a handful of Portland plants in the United States. By 1900, there were dozens. By 1910, the industry was producing tens of millions of barrels of cement a year, and the volume was doubling every few years. By 1916, there were enough manufacturers to form an association, and the association needed a market that would stay big forever. Here is the rhetorical hinge. Portland cement was not invented to be better. It was invented to be faster. Faster to set. Faster to ship. Faster to build. Every advantage Portland has over lime is an advantage on the contractor's clock, not on the building's clock. A lime mortar wall takes weeks to develop initial strength and decades to fully cure. A Portland wall is structurally usable in 24 hours. From the perspective of a man trying to finish a job and collect a check, Portland is a miracle. From the perspective of a building that needs to stand for 200 years, Portland is a downgrade. From the perspective of a manufacturer who needs to sell another bag next week, Portland is the perfect product, because the wall it builds will need to be replaced inside the lifetime of the person who owns it. Not because of safety, not because of performance, because of margin. So how did faster become mandatory? This is where the story turns cold. Through the 1920s and into the 1930s, building codes across the United States were rewritten, not by Congress, not by any single agency. Building codes in America are mostly written at the state and municipal level, and they are written by committees. committees of engineers, architects, manufacturers, and trade representatives. And those committees, in the decades after 1916, were heavily populated by people whose careers were tied to Portland cement. Industry-funded research showed up in the footnotes. Industry-trained engineers showed up in the chairs. Industry pamphlets showed up in the reference binders. None of this required a conspiracy. It only required a checkbook and a generation of patience. The result was predictable. New model codes appeared. State after state adopted them. Foundations, structural walls, load-bearing masonry, all of it shifted toward Portland-based specifications. Lime mortar was not banned. It was not declared illegal. It was simply written out of the spec sheets. The approved materials list shortened. The default binder became Portland. And anything not on the approved list became, in practical terms, unbuildable. You could still mix lime in your backyard. You could still use it on your own outbuildings. But you could not get a permit, you could not pass an inspection, and you could not sign off on a commercial job with it. This is the buried mechanism. Not a ban by name. A quiet exclusion by spec. The cleanest kind of suppression, because nobody ever has to defend it. There's no law to overturn. There's just a list that does not include you anymore. No villain has to stand up in public and say a thing. The thing just stops being on the page. And within one generation, nobody under 50 has ever seen it done. And then came the mortgages. After the Second World War, the American mortgage industry exploded. Returning soldiers, federal housing programs, suburban expansion, all of it driven by a flood of new lending. Levittown went up. Tract housing went up. Millions of new American houses got built in less than a decade, and the lenders needed standards. They needed to know what they were financing, so they leaned on the building codes that were already in place. By the late 1940s and into the 1950s, mortgage underwriting standards effectively required Portland-based foundations for loan approval. If you wanted a mortgage from a major American lender, your house had to sit on Portland concrete. If you wanted to ensure that mortgage against default, the property had to meet the same spec. If you wanted to resell the house 10 years later, the appraiser needed it to fit the same approved list. That is the trap. Lime mortar was still legal, still available, still better. But you could not finance a house built with it. You could not insure it the same way. You could not sell it through the normal channels. The material was not banned. It was just unbankable. And that is how a method disappears without anyone ever signing a ban. Not forgotten by accident. Buried on purpose. Now here is the proof object. The one teased back in the first half of this story. In the mid-1950s, federal materials testing in the United States compared the long-term performance of lime mortar and Portland cement mortar in masonry applications. The work sat within the broader mid-century scientific examination of traditional building materials, the same body of research that historic preservationists still rely on today. And the conclusion, in the language of the period, was that lime mortar outperformed Portland on durability, on breathability, and on the long-term integrity of historic masonry walls. Lime won. On the numbers that matter for a building that has to last, lime won. That finding should have been front-page news. It should have ended the conversation. Instead, it was filed, cataloged, referenced in preservation literature, and almost completely absent from the mainstream construction trade press for the next 40 years. The Portland Cement Association did not need to suppress it. They did not need to fight it. They did not need to write a single rebuttal. They just needed the building codes to stay the way they already were. And they did. The report existed. The truth existed. The market did not change. Every bag of Portland sold for the next 4 decades was sold inside a regulatory system that had already decided the answer before the question was asked. That is what vindication looks like in a buried knowledge story. Not a court case. Not a recall. Just a document that proved the old way was better, sitting on a shelf while the new way kept getting poured. But here is the secret in plain sight. the people who actually have to make buildings last 200 years, already know all of this. Every serious historic restoration project in the United States and Europe uses lime mortar. Mount Vernon, Monticello, Colonial Williamsburg, the cathedrals of England and France, the stone houses of the Cotswolds, the brick streets of Charleston. When the National Park Service publishes preservation guidance for historic masonry, the guidance is explicit. Do not use Portland cement on a lime mortar building. Portland is too hard, too rigid, too impermeable. It traps moisture against the original stone or brick, and over time, it destroys the very wall it is supposed to protect. There is a specific failure pattern that preservationists have a name for, where a stone facade that survived 2 centuries of weather starts crumbling within 20 years of being patched with Portland, because the modern mortar will not let the wall breathe. The Park Service has been saying this in print for decades. The preservation trade has been saying it for longer. They never stopped using lime. They just stopped telling you. So what does this mean for you? Stay with me, because this is the part that matters. Lime mortar is still fully available in the United States and the United Kingdom. You can buy lime putty by the bucket. You can buy bagged hydrated lime at most masonry suppliers. You can order natural hydraulic lime, graded NHL 2, NHL 3.5, or NHL 5, depending on how much initial strength you need. The home scale equipment is the same equipment you would use for any small masonry job. A mixer, a trowel, a hawk, a jointer, time, patience, a weekend, a quarter acre, and a basic setup is enough to start. There are masonry suppliers in nearly every state that will ship lime materials directly to your door. There are restoration masons within driving distance of most rural properties who will teach you the basics in an afternoon. The knowledge is not gone. It has just been quiet. You can repoint a stone foundation. You can lay a garden wall. You can build a spring house. You can patch a chimney. You can rebuild a root cellar. You can restore a barn. You can do every one of these things with a material that, if mixed properly, will outlast you, outlast your children, and outlast the house itself. A lime, repointed wall, done correctly, has a service life of over 100 years. A Portland repointed wall on the same stone usually fails within 25, often sooner, and it takes some of the original stone with it when it goes. Every time a homeowner pays a contractor to patch a stone foundation with Portland, they are buying a problem that will come due in their lifetime, and they are paying for the destruction of a wall that was originally built to last forever. Think about that as a household economics problem. Every bag of Portland you buy is a bag with a 50-year clock on it. Every batch of lime mortar you mix is a step toward a property that does not need you to come back and redo the same joint in a generation. One is a monthly tax on dependents. The other is a one-time act of permanence. And if you have ever looked at the cost of repointing a Portland patch stone foundation, you already know which one the contractor would rather sell you. This is not just mortar. It is a worldview about what you own and how long it is supposed to last. The Amish never argued any of this. They never lobbied. They never sent a representative to a code committee. They never bought a full-page advertisement in a trade journal. They just kept building, and their buildings are still standing. There's a barn outside of Strasburg, Pennsylvania, that went up in the early 1880s, mortar joints still clean, still tight, still load-bearing, while a poured concrete equipment pad, less than 100 feet away, put in during the late 1990s, is already breaking apart at the corners. That is the whole argument, sitting in one farmyard, in 2 materials, separated by a century. No marketing, no association, no lobbying budget, just a wall and another wall, and the dates carved into each one. How many other simple, durable, useful things have been quietly written out of your life the same way? Not banned, just buried. Not illegal, just unbankable. Not gone, just removed from the approved list. Once you see the pattern in mortar, you start to see it everywhere. In food, in fuel, in tools, in medicine, in the way a house used to be built versus the way a house is built today. The pattern is the same every time. There was an older way. The older way worked. The older way was harder to sell. So the older way got written out of the page, one specification at a time, until almost nobody remembered it. You are now in a small group of people who notice this. So here is the engagement question. Go look up the oldest building still standing in your county. Drive out to it if you can. Run your hand along the joints. Look at the mortar. It will almost certainly be lime. Then come back and tell me what you found. What county? What building? What year? Because the proof of this whole story is sitting in your own area, on a wall someone laid by hand a long time before any of us were here, and it has been waiting for you to notice it. And the next piece of this is bigger. The same Amish communities that kept the lime mortar tradition alive also kept another method alive, a method for storing food at a steady 52 degrees Fahrenheit, year-round, without a single watt of electricity, without a compressor, without a single moving part. The mainstream forgot it for the same reasons they forgot the mortar. Wait until you see how it works.